They say that on foggy nights in the Thornwick Mountains, you might see a light moving between the trees, tall and cold and blue as winter ice. The old-timers will tell you to look away, to turn back, to never follow that flickering flame no matter how lost you might be. Because the Candleman doesn't lead travelers home, he leads them down. This is the story of how I learned that some warnings should never be ignored. The mountain road to Thornwick had been carved from stone and stubbornness sometime before the Great War, though locals would tell you it had always been there, a thin ribbon of dirt and gravel that wound through pine forests so dense they swallowed sound. Mary pulled her rental car over at the weathered wooden sign that marked the village limits, its paint long since peeled away by mountain winters and summer storms. Population 127, the sign read, though she suspected that number was optimistic. The October air bit at her cheeks as she stepped out to stretch her legs. She was a travel writer, drawn to forgotten places by the promise of untold stories, and Thornwick had caught her attention through a single paragraph in an obscure hiking guide. Remote settlement accessible only by mountain road, known for distinctive local folklore, no modern amenities. The trees pressed close on either side of the road, their branches forming a cathedral of shadow overhead. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from chimneys, and the warm glow of windows promised civilization. But there was something else in the air, a tension that made the silence feel heavy rather than peaceful. As she drove the final mile into town, an old man emerged from the tree line, waving his arms. Mary slowed to a stop, rolling down her window. "Turn back," he said without preamble. His voice carried the weight of mountain winters and hard-earned wisdom. "Town's not safe after dark, especially not for strangers." "I have a reservation at the inn," Mary replied, studying his weathered face. "Is there some kind of problem?" The old man glanced toward the darkening sky. "Problem's been here longer than any of us. You do well to heed the old warnings, miss. When night falls on these mountains, keep your curtains drawn and your doors locked. And if you see a light moving through the trees..." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "Don't follow it, no matter what." Before Mary could ask what he meant, the man melted back into the shadows between the pines, leaving her alone with the mountain wind and a growing sense of unease. The Thornwick Inn sat at the village's heart like an old dog guarding its bones, weathered but sturdy, with windows that glowed amber against the gathering dusk. Mary parked beside a rusted pickup truck and made her way to the front door, her footsteps echoing on the wooden porch. Inside, the warmth embraced her immediately. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting shadows on walls lined with faded photographs of the mountain through the seasons. Behind the reception desk stood a woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Mary?" the woman asked, though there couldn't have been much doubt. Mary was clearly the only guest expected. "I'm Martha. Welcome to Thornwick." As Martha led her upstairs to her room, Mary mentioned her encounter with the old man on the road. Martha's hands tightened on the banister. "That would be Henrik," Martha said. "He takes the warnings more seriously than most. Lost his grandson 20 years back." "Lost him how?" Martha paused at the landing, her expression troubled. "To the Candleman." The room was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the village square and the dark mountains beyond. As Martha showed her the amenities, Mary pressed gently for more information. "The Candleman is just an old story, Martha said, but her voice lacked conviction. Been told in these parts for generations. They say he appears on foggy nights, walking the mountain paths with a candle flame where his head should be, tall as a pine tree, dressed in a coat that seems to be made of shadows. And he killed Henrik's grandson, Martha continued, avoiding the question. Lights their way when they're turned around in the dark. But the path he shows... She shuddered. It doesn't lead home. As night settled over the mountains like a thick blanket, Martha prepared to leave. At the door, she turned back. There's coffee and sandwiches in the kitchen if you get hungry, but whatever you do, don't go outside after midnight. And if you hear someone calling your name from the woods... She met Mary's eyes. It's not someone you want to answer. Mary had always been a light sleeper, so when the voice called her name at midnight, she woke immediately. For a moment she lay still in the narrow bed, wondering if she'd been dreaming. Then it came again, drifting through the window like smoke. Mary. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It seemed to come from the forest itself, carried on the mountain wind that rattled the window panes. Against every instinct Martha had tried to instill in her, Mary found herself drawn to the window. The village square lay bathed in moonlight, empty except for shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. At the edge of the forest, something tall and dark stood between the pine trees. As Mary watched, a small flame flickered to life where the figure's head should be. Not the warm yellow of candlelight, but a cold, blue-white glow that made her eyes water. The candleman raised one impossibly long arm and beckoned. Mary, lost and far from home. The voice was inside her head now, bypassing her ears entirely. It spoke of loneliness, of being cut off from everything familiar, of the comfort that came with following someone who knew the way. Her hand was on the window latch before she realized she'd moved. The cold air rushed in as she opened the window, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and something else. Something that reminded her of burnt offerings and ancient rituals. The candleman stood perfectly still, his flame dancing hypnotically. "Come," the voice whispered. "Let me show you the secret paths. Let me lead you home." Mary was halfway through the window when a hand grabbed her arm. She spun around to find Martha, still in her nightgown, her face pale with fear. "What are you doing?" Martha hissed, pulling Mary back into the room. "He was calling me," Mary said, the spell broken. "The candleman. He said he'd show me the way home." Martha slammed the window shut and drew the curtains. "That's how he gets them. Makes them think they're lost when they're safe. Makes them think he's salvation when he's damnation." She guided Mary to sit on the bed. Henrik's grandson followed that light. They found his bones 3 days later at the bottom of Widow's Drop, a cliff face so sheer that even the mountain goats won't go near it. "But why?" Mary asked, her mind clearing as the cold mountain air left her lungs. "What does he want?" "Some say he was a man once, long ago," Martha whispered. "A guide who led travelers through these mountains for money. But greed made him careless, and he started leading people into danger, robbing them, leaving them to die. The mountain itself cursed him, they say. Now he's bound to these paths, doomed to lead others to their deaths for all eternity. And the candle? His soul, burning down to nothing, night after night. But it never goes out, never dies." Martha stood, smoothing down her nightgown. "I'll stay here tonight. Make sure you don't try to follow that light again." But even as Martha settled into the room's single chair, Mary found her eyes drawn back to the curtained window, where a faint blue glow still flickered at the edges of the fabric. Morning brought no relief from the previous night's terror. If anything, the bright mountain sunlight made the whole experience seem more unsettling, as if the Candleman's influence extended even into daylight hours. Mary woke to find Martha gone, but a note on the nightstand promised breakfast downstairs and answers to her questions. In the inn's small dining room, Martha served coffee that could wake the dead and eggs from her own chickens. Other villagers had gathered, an informal morning council that Mary suspected met whenever outsiders encountered their particular problem. Henrik was there, the old man from the road, along with a younger woman introduced as Doctor Thorn, who served as both the village's physician and its unofficial historian. There was also Tom, a forester whose family had lived in these mountains for 5 generations. "We should start with the records, Doctor," Thorn said, spreading yellowed papers across the table. The first documented encounter was in 1847, when a group of surveying the railway route went missing. 3 of the 5 men were found at the bottom of various cliffs and ravines. The other 2 were never recovered. But the stories go back further, Tom added. "My great-great-grandfather used to tell tales of a light-bearer who walked these mountains. Said the Cherokee warned against following strange lights in the forest, that some spirits weren't interested in helping the living." Henrik leaned forward, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "It got my grandson, just like Martha told you. Billy was 17, thought he was smart enough to handle anything these mountains could throw at him. Went camping with friends up near Raven's Peak." His voice broke slightly. "Boys said they heard him talking to someone in the middle of the night. By morning, he was gone." Dr. Thorne consulted her papers. "In the past century, we've documented 43 disappearances that fit the pattern. Most are ruled accidents by outside authorities, people getting lost, falling from cliffs. But everyone here knows better." "Why doesn't anyone leave?" Mary asked. "If this thing is so dangerous, why stay?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Finally, Tom spoke. "Some have tried, but Thornwick gets in your blood. These mountains, they're part of us. And besides," he exchanged glances with the others, "where would we go? How do you explain to outsiders that your hometown is haunted by something that defies explanation?" "There's something else, Doctor," Thorne said quietly. "Something we don't like to talk about. The disappearances don't happen randomly. They follow a pattern, roughly every 18 months, like clockwork. And we're approaching that time again." Martha nodded grimly. "Last one was a hiker from Portland about 16 months ago. Young man named Marcus. Experienced climber, knew what he was doing. But experience doesn't matter when you're dealing with something that exists outside natural law." Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You think I'm the next target? Outsiders are always more susceptible," Henrik said. "Something about not being rooted here, not understanding the true nature of what walks these paths. The Candleman feeds on that vulnerability." As the meeting broke up and the villagers returned to their daily routines, Mary found herself standing at the inn's window, staring out at the forest that had tried to claim her the night before. Somewhere in those shadows, something ancient and hungry was waiting for darkness to fall again. Despite the villagers' warnings, Mary couldn't bring herself to leave Thornwick. Part of it was professional curiosity. This was exactly the kind of authentic folklore that her readers craved. But there was something deeper, too. The mountain had gotten into her blood just as Tom had warned, and the thought of returning to her apartment in Seattle felt like betrayal. She spent the day exploring the village, documenting the weathered buildings and spectacular views, interviewing residents about their experiences with the supernatural. Everyone had a story, though most were second-hand. A cousin who saw a strange light, a grandmother who warned against traveling certain paths after dark. But as afternoon faded toward evening, Mary noticed a change in the villagers' behavior. Windows that had been open to the crisp fall air were shuttered tight. People hurried along the streets with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. By sunset, the village felt like a town under siege. Martha found her in the inn's small library, reading through a collection of local newspaper clippings. "You need to see something," Martha said, her voice tense. "Come with me, but bring your coat and your camera if you want. Though I'm not sure anyone would believe the pictures." They walked to the village's tiny cemetery, where weathered headstones marked the final resting places of Thornwick's dead. But Martha led Mary past the regular graves to a section at the back, where 7 larger stones stood in a rough circle. "These aren't graves," Martha explained. "They're anchors, placed by the village founders to keep the Candleman confined to this area. As long as they stand, he can't leave these mountains." Each stone was carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dying light. Not Cherokee, not European, but something older and more primal. At the center of the circle stood a metal brazier, its surface black with decades of use. "Every time someone disappears," Martha continued, "we perform a ritual. Light a fire in the brazier, speak the names of the dead, and ask the mountain to accept the sacrifice and spare the rest of us for another season." "Sacrifice?" Mary's blood went cold. "You're talking about human sacrifice." "Not by our choice," Martha said quickly, "but the Candleman feeds on those who follow his light. It's an old compact, older than the village, older than memory. We maintain the boundaries, keep the secret, and in return, most of us are left alone." Other villagers began to arrive, carrying bundles of wood and small personal items, photographs, jewelry, locks of hair. Henrik was there, carrying a baseball card that had belonged to his grandson. Dr. Thorne brought medical records. Tom carried a compass that had belonged to his father. "Items connected to the missing," Martha explained. "We burn them to complete the cycle, to make sure their spirits don't get trapped between worlds." As the ritual began, Mary found herself both horrified and fascinated. This wasn't evil, it was survival. A community doing whatever it took to coexist with something beyond their understanding. The fire caught quickly, sending sparks into the darkening sky, and the villagers began to speak the names of the dead. Billy, Marcus, Jennifer, Thomas. The list went on, 43 names stretching back generations. With each name, Mary felt the weight of history pressing down on her. This wasn't just folklore. It was a living, breathing reality that had shaped this community for more than a century. As the last name was spoken, a wind rose from nowhere, scattering the sparks and making the trees bend and sway. In the distance, beyond the cemetery gates, a cold light flickered to life. The Candleman had come to claim his due. The Candleman stood at the edge of the cemetery, just beyond the circle of protective stones. his impossible height making the ancient pines look like saplings. The flame that served as his head burned brighter tonight, casting blue-white shadows that seemed to move independently of his form. Mary felt the pull immediately, stronger than the night before, almost irresistible. Her feet began to move toward the cemetery gate before she realized what was happening. "Mary, no!" Martha grabbed her arm, but Mary barely felt the contact. The Candleman's flame was hypnotic, beautiful in its alien coldness. It promised answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask, showed her visions of paths through the mountains that no human had ever walked. "Let me show you," the voice whispered in her mind. "Let me take you home." But something was wrong with the vision this time. The path the Candleman showed didn't lead to comfort or safety. It led down, down into darkness, to a place where the mountain's bones were exposed, and ancient things waited in the depths. Mary could see the bodies of previous victims, their remains scattered across stone ledges that had never known sunlight. "Fight it!" Henrik's voice cut through the supernatural compulsion. "Remember what you've learned. Remember what he really is." Mary forced herself to focus on the old man's words, on the weight of history she'd absorbed throughout the day. The Candleman wasn't a savior. He was a predator, something that fed on desperation and confusion. And she wasn't lost. She was exactly where she needed to be. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't follow you." The Candleman's flame flickered, dimmed for just a moment. Then it blazed brighter than ever, and his form began to change. The shadow coat fell away, revealing something that might once have been human, but had been twisted by decades of supernatural hunger. His limbs were too long, his fingers ending in points that gleamed like ice. And where his face should have been, there was only the cold flame, burning with malevolent intelligence. "Then I'll come to you," the voice said, no longer seductive but filled with rage. The Candleman took a step forward toward the circle of stones. The protective barriers that had held him for generations began to crack and crumble, their ancient power failing against his fury. "The ritual," Dr. Thorne shouted over the wind that had risen from nowhere. "Something's wrong with the ritual." Mary looked around at the frightened faces of the villagers, at the generations of people who had lived in the shadow of this monster, and understood. The ritual wasn't protection, it was appeasement. They weren't keeping the Candleman contained. They were feeding him, giving him what he needed to maintain his hold on these mountains. The stones aren't anchors, she realized aloud. They're a summoning circle. You've been calling him here. Martha's face went white. "That's impossible. The ritual has protected us for how long?" Mary demanded. "How long have the disappearances really been going on? Since the stones were placed?" The truth hit them all at once. The village founders hadn't been trying to contain an existing threat. They'd been creating one, making a bargain with something dark and hungry in exchange for prosperity and protection from other dangers. But bargains with entities like the Candleman always came with a price. The protective circle finally shattered completely, and the Candleman stepped into the cemetery proper. Up close, Mary could see that his flame wasn't just cold light. It was composed of souls, the trapped essence of everyone he'd claimed over the decades. Billy's face flickered in the depths, then Marcus, then dozens of others, all screaming silently. "Run," she told the villagers, but they seemed frozen in place, paralyzed by the weight of their ancestors' sins. Mary did the only thing she could think of. She threw herself at the brazier, scattering the burning offerings and stomping on the flames. If the ritual summoned him, then maybe ending it would send him back. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Candleman let out a shriek that shattered windows in the village below, his form beginning to flicker and fade. But as he dissolved, the trapped souls in his flame were released, and Mary felt them rushing through her, decades of memories and final moments flooding her consciousness. She saw the truth then. The Candleman hadn't been a guide cursed for his greed. He'd been the village's first sacrifice, a traveling salesman who'd stumbled onto their dark ritual in 1847. They'd killed him and bound his spirit to the mountains, creating a guardian that would eliminate anyone who might threaten their secret. But guardians could become monsters, and monsters always grew hungry. Mary woke up 3 days later in a hospital in the valley below, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The doctor said hikers had found her unconscious on a mountain path, suffering from exposure and dehydration. The village of Thornwick, they told her, had been abandoned for decades. Nothing there but empty buildings and overgrown roads. But Mary remembered everything. The inn, the villagers, the ritual, the truth about the Candleman. She tried to tell the doctors, tried to convince them to search the mountains for survivors, but they dismissed her account as hypothermia, induced hallucinations. When she was well enough to travel, Mary drove back up the mountain road. The weathered sign was still there, though now it read, Population Zero, Historic Site. The buildings stood empty, their windows dark, their doors hanging open to reveal rooms thick with dust and cobwebs. There was no sign that anyone had lived there in years. At the cemetery, the circle of stones lay in ruins, shattered by some tremendous force. The metal brazier was gone, leaving only a circle of scorched earth. But in the center of that circle, something new had been planted. A single candle, its flame burning steady and cold in the mountain wind. Mary understood then what had really happened. By destroying the ritual, she hadn't freed the trapped souls. She'd inherited their burden. The Candleman was gone, but his purpose remained. Someone had to guard the mountain's secrets. Someone had to ensure that curious travelers didn't dig too deep into things better left buried. As night fell over the abandoned village, Mary felt the change beginning. Her body grew tall and thin. Her flesh became shadow, and where her head had been, a cold flame flickered to life. She could see the souls of the Candleman's victims swirling within her new form, no longer trapped but not quite free, bound to her service as she was bound to the mountain. In the distance, headlights wound their way up the narrow mountain road. Another curious traveler, another story seeker drawn by the mystery of Thornwick's sudden abandonment. Mary smiled, though she no longer had a mouth to smile with. She had stories to tell, after all, and a path to show. The flame that was her head burned brighter as she stepped out of the cemetery, moving with inhuman grace toward the approaching car. Behind her, the abandoned village settled deeper into shadow, keeping its secrets safe for another generation. In the mountains, some lights were never meant to be followed, but they always were.